Good evening. I really appreciate you coming out tonight, knowing the weather, knowing there's some football game tomorrow. But it is a real pleasure. It's my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Kevin Cahill. Dr. Cahill will be presenting the Stan Kimmett Lecture on Public Service. This is all a part of the President's Lecture Series. I want to acknowledge President Engstrom, who couldn't be here tonight, for his support, and to welcome Dr. Cahill on his first trip to Montana. And we hope that in the future he could visit us at a warm time. In preparing for this introduction, I found myself going through a process hopefully very familiar to Dr. Cahill, and that's the process of triage. 3 options, several ways to do this. First thought was I could do a long list of his honorary doctorates. There are 27 awards, titles that he currently holds. And I thought, well, no, that's going to really severely shorten his time to talk, and that's not what we're here for. I could have told one of the many stories that I've read in his memoirs, but I wouldn't do it justice. I really think I would leave it to Kevin to do those. So the third option was to briefly summarize what I know of his accomplishments, and to put a personal spin on it. As director of pre-medical advising on this campus for just this year, I'm going to turn it back over to our director, Diana Lurie, at the end of the year. I want to talk a little bit, just briefly, about what he means to pre-medical professionals and inspiring those people. So to tell you a little bit about Dr. Cahill, he was born in the Bronx, the son of Irish immigrants. He attended Cornell University Medical College in New York, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine for a specialty. In his career, he could often be found on the ground coordinating disaster relief efforts in as many as 65 different countries, sites such as Haiti, Somalia, Beirut, New Orleans, Libya, Nicaragua, last year's Grizz-Cat game. Along the way, he's happened to have time to write 39 books. He's advised and currently advises presidents of the UN General Assembly. He's discovered causes of epidemics such as the Kurdish refugees leaving Iraq. At one time, he spent a month as the personal physician of Pope John Paul II following his gunshot wound. He worked alongside Mother Teresa in Calcutta. He's a humanitarian, a detective, a writer, a physician, an activist, a proud father and grandfather, a visionary regarding subjects such as education, disaster relief, the war on terror, and health care. As interim director of pre-medical sciences, I see some of the best, brightest young pre-med students on this campus. They're preparing to go out into the world and hopefully make a difference. For these students, and many others like them on this campus in other disciplines, men such as Kevin Cahill serve as sterling examples of how to do it right. We hope that many of our students will become global leaders in the future in the tradition of Dr. Cahill. Our own Global Grizzlies program, which you heard about at lunch a little bit, aims to encourage this in our students. The world needs more heroes. You've heard that many times. It's a wonderful honor that we get to hear tonight from Dr. Kevin Cahill, so let's welcome him.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think the one thing I would never want to be known as is a hero. So I'll the rest, some of the facts. I wrote a talk entitled Romance and Reality in Humanitarian Action, and I'll tell you about the title in a moment. But in the prologue to his autobiography, the Nobel laureate Bertrand Russell captured at the age of 90 motivations I have identified with since my 20s or teens. Russell wrote, and I quote, "Three passions, simple but overwhelmingly strong, have governed my life: the longing for love, the search for knowledge, and unbearable pity for the suffering of mankind. These passions, like great winds, have blown me hither and thither in a wayward course over a great ocean of anguish, reaching to the very verge of despair. Love and knowledge, so far as they were possible, led me upwards toward the heavens, but always pity brought me back to earth. Echoes of cries of pain reverberate in my heart. Children in famine, victims tortured by oppressors, helpless old people a burden to their sons, and the whole world of loneliness, poverty, and pain make a mockery of what human life should be. I long to alleviate this evil, but I cannot, and I too suffer." And that was his quote. C.P. Snow noted in Science and Government that, and I quote him, "No one I have read has found the right answers. Very few have asked the right questions. The best I can do is tell a story." So tonight I will offer you a few connected, very personal observations drawn from a lifelong journey to many troubled parts of the world, and then leave ample time to hear your views and exchange ideas in the academic ambience of the University of Montana. And by the way, I'm delighted to be in Montana. And I'm looking forward to going up the Black Root River or something tomorrow with a friend. So my title for tonight's talk should probably have been reversed after I thought about this. For appreciating the reality of life is essential in discovering true romance. So I'm going to start with realities. There are definite harsh realities in humanitarian fieldwork. And no amount of diplomatic sophistry can dehumanize the horrors of war and the waste of innocent lives. They are not dull statistics, but real people who suffer and die in such situations. In the sad settings of refugee camps, mothers and children are the disposable refuse of global insecurity. Becoming a child soldier or a sex slave are terribly realistic options for innocent youngsters. But it is at times of great calamity and suffering, in humanitarian crises, where the developed and the developing worlds most intimately interact, and therein lies both the challenge and the opportunity. These occasions, if mismanaged, cause further divisions in an ever more polarized world between the haves and the have-nots. But if handled correctly, with forethought and planning, with sensitivity and clinical efficiency, then something profoundly good may emerge. There may be no more important arena in which academic standards need to be urgently applied than in the repetitive humanitarian crises that shame our so-called civilization. In conflict zones, a physician deals not only with the physical effects of trauma, but also with the dark and tangled roots of hatred and the incipient revenge that blossoms in such unrelenting misery. Yet, with patience and respect for others' human dignity, by balancing passion and compassion, by practicing civility and trying to understand the bases for hostility in those we assist, one can learn many lessons, particularly from the dispossessed and the oppressed, and develop a special approach to life. Titles rarely matter in such situations. Friendships and traditions do. They maintain our spirits, especially during difficult times, and produce rich memories as well as the necessary resolution to carry on very hard work. One quickly becomes aware that there are no simple answers to the multiple problems that face victims of natural and man-made disasters, and that solutions, when they can be constructed, draw on many, many disciplines. When I first began working in humanitarian crises, we had to devise acceptable definitions to describe our goals and actions. Words, simple phonetic sounds had to be created to characterize the levels of chaos that follow disasters and distinguish different phases of responses. Such crises, almost always with political and military components, often resulting from conflicts and involving large numbers of people, have been the primary area of my work and teaching. After my wife died almost 8 years ago, I recall sitting up at night making multiple, maybe silly lists. One documented as Mark said that I had at that time worked in 65 countries, mostly in refugee camps, in conflict and post-conflict situations. Disaster management is an evolving science, embracing every stage from prevention and preparedness through rapid assessment and cluster assignments all the way to reconstruction and development. When I was young and very innocent, I thought I was inordinately important as a medical doctor in a refugee camp. But it didn't take long to look around and realize, with growing humility, that those in charge of water or food or shelter or security or sanitation or education were indispensable partners. It also didn't take long to realize that no one could accomplish very much working alone. One of the main obstacles that had to be overcome if there was to be any progress in restoring a semblance of stability for those who had lost everything were our own restrictive professional barriers. Rigid definitions of duty cripple programs in the field. There is that inevitable time when, at least in my experience, one must move beyond the traditional confines of any discipline. There had been no courses, except possibly in philosophy or anthropology or comparative literature, that prepared me for the almost bizarre demands of one faces in establishing and managing camps for tens and hundreds of thousands of frightened, ill, and endangered people, the vast majority being extremely vulnerable women and children. 3 examples demonstrate different challenges that force the expansion of my traditional role as a physician. I'll give those. Early in my career, I found myself in the southern Sudan, responsible not only for health concerns, but also for providing basic human services, including security. It certainly was of little help to a young girl to tell her that her malaria was cured if she was raped every time she went foraging for firewood. Another example, in 1972, an earthquake destroyed Managua, Nicaragua. I served as chief medical advisor, sharing a tent with the then president. There, I learned how politics and corruption can pollute so-called relief missions. A significant percentage of the international aid was openly looted by the president's cronies, and donors did not even complain for, quote, diplomatic, end quote, reasons. One sadly realized the limitations of altruism in the face of evil. And a third example would be retraining and resettling large numbers of refugees that was essential in Somalia after the Sahel drought caused a mass migration across Africa. I was directing camps with almost 1 million refugees. The only outlet was the Indian Ocean. Trying to teach nomads to abandon an age-old dependency on camel and cattle to seek survival as fishermen was an interesting exercise for an evolving tropicalist. The experiment worked, at least for a while. There were also obviously diplomatic possibilities in our public health work that could and needed to be exploited. Medicine offered an almost ideal platform for preventive diplomacy. Almost 50 years ago, in the midst of a raging civil war in southern Sudan, we were able to establish what were called, quote, corridors of tranquility or immunization breaks. These were de facto ceasefire zones and eventually became temporary bridges to understanding and peace. That peace didn't last, but those corridors are still recalled fondly by those who must now continue the search for common ground in the blood-soaked sands of Darfur and South Sudan. Managing complex humanitarian emergencies, particularly in the midst of conflicts and disasters, is not a field for amateurs. Good intentions are a common but tragically inadequate substitute for well-planned, carefully coordinated and implemented operations that, like a good sentence, must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Compassion and charity are only elements in humanitarian assistance programs. Alone, they are self-indulgent emotions that for a short time may satisfy the donor, but will always fail to help victims in desperate straits. When I first began working in complex humanitarian crises, there were no accepted standards or training programs. In fact, there wasn't even, as I noted, a common vocabulary. What was desperately needed was the creation of a new profession, one that could embrace the many areas of expertise required to provide an overall response. This is where academia had to enter the picture. We began some 20 years ago to offer new practical university-level programs geared to the unique needs of international aid workers. Through Fordham University's Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs, one can now take an undergraduate minor, a postgraduate master's degree, and in training experienced humanitarian workers, we now have over 1,600 graduates from 133 nations. Whatever our differences in cultural background or material fortune, we all share a common destiny, and working to realize that forges very close bonds that ultimately tie us together. So much for reality. I now turn to romance. My wife used to say that I was the only person she knew who could come home after 3 months in a Somali refugee camp and keep her awake all night describing in very great detail how beautiful it was. Yes, there were incredible scenes of sadness and evil, but there were also exquisite sunrises and sunsets in the desert, and the almost unexpected sound of children laughing, and the incredible strength of mothers and grandmothers coping in a daily struggle to survive. So that is my second and equally important theme, the beauty and romance of life. Much depends on how the mind's eye sees and interprets the fields in which we work. Over 50 years ago, I arrived in Calcutta and fell in love with a way of life. I find romance in settings that others might quite legitimately see only as dirty, broken down wastelands. Surely those negatives existed in Calcutta, but amidst the fetid stenches of Indian urban decay, I mainly recall the strong aroma of exotic spices. I close my eyes but usually see saffron robes rather than soiled rags. I hear music in the cacophonous sounds of the slums and in the long silence of a city drenched in the humid heat that comes with monsoon rains. Over the next 4 months, I attended every morning clinical rounds at the All India Institute of Tropical Medicine, but being young and indefatigable, I also spent every afternoon helping to tend the dying in a gutter with an then unknown Albanian nun. I was immersed in a wonder-filled, strange culture and faced utterly new challenges and, just as importantly, new opportunities. One of the most important lessons of India that has remained with me for life and helped determine what I have tried to do and how was the realization that one must stay calm and focused in the midst of chaos if one wanted to help others. There was no time for self-indulgent personal concerns. The petty needs that so often dominate our lives distract us from getting critical tasks accomplished. One quickly learned with embarrassment that our own individual cares simply didn't matter much in the face of what others were suffering every day, all day, in the disaster that life offered them. Since then, during a very full, joyous career, if that is an appropriate definition for a journey where there were few guideposts along the way, I've worked all over the world, mostly in refugee camps and war zones. I saw plenty of tragedy during those travels, and there are scenes seared into my soul. The appalling waste of life and of human dignity, pain that I was often helpless to relieve, the stares of starving children, and the dying gasps of too many mothers in childbirth. Yet I always realized how privileged I was to serve, to share, and even begin to identify with those caught in the crossfires of conflicts not of their making. A spiritual solidarity develops in just being with them. They were my brothers and sisters. In the most sordid situations, I have always felt inordinately humbled to see, often with amazement, but always with admiration, the courage and resiliency of the downtrodden, those who seem to have been totally overwhelmed, but then, like the phoenix, rise again from the ashes. I have always returned, but in some important ways I never returned from refugee camps, grateful to be allowed to participate in their valiant efforts. Relief work in the developing world is often frustrating, and progress can be very slow indeed. Accomplishments are rarely grandiose. I recall asking a former professor, one of the great academic mentors of my life, what he thought he had accomplished after 5 years trying and ultimately failing to establish a medical school in southern Sudan. "What have you really done?" I asked. After a few minutes he responded, "I think the drain in front of the clinic works." I have helped, even heal many desperate victims in humanitarian crises, and they in turn helped, healed, instructed, and changed me. I have been the recipient of their kindness. They who had so little gave their meager supplies to me, and on more than one occasion offered to protect me with their lives, for that is the obligation of a host in the remote Islamic lands that were for years my home. I learned much about the values of clan loyalty and family love around campfires in the deserts of Somalia and Sudan, with elders who were guided by values as noble as our Judeo-Christian traditions. My outlook and my message for you are greatly influenced by them. I have been caught behind the lines in armed conflicts and seen senseless slaughter from Beirut to Managua and all across the scarred landscape of modern Africa. Somehow, in the twisted wreckage of war and in the squalor of refugee camps, the incredible beauty of humanity prevailed for me, as it does for most of those privileged to work in humanitarian assistance. It is that perspective that sustains us on what otherwise might seem like an endless trip through hell on earth. Being dog dirty and exhausted was a very small price to pay for knowing one could slowly bring order out of confusion, hope out of despair, determination out of fear. These were the incalculable, almost indescribable rewards. It takes time to refocus the romance of youth into reflective, lasting programs in humanitarian crises, to change the passion of love into healing projects. One learned from failures and then struggled ahead with more hard work. As Samuel Beckett once wrote, "We must try again, and then you fail again, but the next time you fail better." My wife, Kate, came with me to troubled areas around the world. She was not a physician or a health worker, but she was my indispensable partner, sharing in all the challenging chores that are part of everyday humanitarian work. She was my moral compass. It would certainly have been easier and safer to reap the rewards assured by a predictable medical practice at home, but that was not what fate offered us. We discovered a new world and ourselves in the midst of revolutions. Several of them were actually planned in our living room. We were able to share in the dreams and aspirations of men and women in the third world who were fighting for freedom, equality, basic human rights, and often for their very survival. In such situations, silence and isolation are simply not viable options. In this era of instant communications, there are universal moral values that make it impossible for any of us to hide from massive sufferings. And mere compassion is an utterly inadequate response. We just are not free to stay in some blissful state of denial, to think that expressions of concern or endless discussions will suffice. Ultimately, each of us must find our own way, hone our own tools as we continue the journey of life. A trek where I hope you too will find beauty and companionship and joy, where the initial impression may seem like only blood and sweat and tears. That, at least, has been my experience. Maybe my tales will broaden your horizons and even help you in love, for that is what drives us onwards. Love ultimately is all that matters. It is the substance and cement that binds us together. It is important to see both the romance and the reality in life, and to never, ever allow yourself to be fenced in by those futile concerns of self-security or fear or despair. Most of you already know from your own periods of community service that there is often more beauty and understanding, consideration and self-growth on those harsh and difficult frontiers than in the refined, protected environments of the establishment. Verities do not change with time or with continents. They are the same in Mombasa or Missoula or Managua. I thank you for the privilege of being with you and hope that we may all continue to find flowers hidden amidst the weeds of life. Thank you.
So at this time, we'd invite questions for Dr. Cahill. Please remember to use the microphones. We are podcasting this. We're not going to get your questions if you're not on mic. So please use the microphones, and we'd be happy to entertain questions.
It's not clear to me, so I hope it's not clear to all of you. So somebody have a question?
Dr. Cahill, you spoke this afternoon about what you called the professionalism of humanitarian aid. I wonder if you might explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, we had an hour and a half this afternoon talking about a very complex field that goes back really to almost the origins of human desire to help one another, and there are records that go back into the centuries before Jesus came on earth. And it has evolved, and more in recent years, it's evolved that people, for various reasons, want to, as I talked in the talk tonight, want to make a profession. You have to have something. You have to have academia that can offer diplomas and degrees to give the workers the dignity that they're going to be working in. And so there is a move. There are dangers to the move because no one wants to crush the very noble, altruistic feelings that motivated many humanitarian workers over the centuries. But as I try to point out in here, that's not a profession. That's just people trying to do good. Very often, seems to me, trying to, as I said this afternoon, trying to find why are we human? Why are we civilized? What makes us that? Where do we find good in ourselves? And so that was the motivation. And as I said, someone once talked of humanitarianism as a way to find some way of addressing suffering rather than just mourning. So that's what humanitarians do. You go out and you try to work, but it's not a small business any longer. It's estimated, very accurately estimated, that in 2010, there's about somewhere around $15 billion devoted to international humanitarian assistance. There are several 100,000 people who work at this field full time. And so the need to make some standards of training, some standards of accreditation, some standards of certification, what professions like medicine, and as I said this afternoon, stumble towards a profession. It's a sort of messy evolution where people in medicine went from being barber surgeons to surgeons, and then people felt that if you didn't have proper training, you were a danger to the community. And therefore, they tried to make it possible to license people, and if you weren't licensed, you weren't allowed. Now, humanitarian work is moving in that direction. There are some grave dangers, I think, along that path. And one is that the people in the most troubled parts of the world are the ones who really deliver the care. It's not just the big-time NGOs or governments that you read about in this great nation of ours. It's the local people at the level. And if they get excluded from this so-called professionalism, which is really a great danger because they don't have the money to go to universities, and people have various reasons that they want to be the one to accredit you or certify you, then I think we're going to lose something. So I think we're moving in a path of trying to set standards of who will be recognized, but I hope with some awareness of the pitfalls that have occurred in other areas. Yes, sir.
Well, I have a two-part question, and you can answer as briefly as you want to or as long as you want to, or whatever length. The one is, how did you get started? Obviously, you were trained as a physician. Not every physician goes into humanitarian aid. So what was it that inspired you? And secondly, and what could inspire all of us or our youth to get started in that direction? And secondly, what do you see after being in so many troubled zones in so many parts of the world, what do you see that needs to be done on the macro level to prevent these humanitarian crises?
I don't know that I have any answer to the second question, but you certainly realize if you're doing humanitarian work that politics and power and everything intrude, and it can intrude on your ability to carry out what you perceive as the humanitarian sort of neutral, protected space. And so we don't live in an unreal world. We live in a very realistic, people in humanitarian work know that every day we have to deal with realities of politics. There's compromises that have to be made every day. You have to recognize that if you're going to get food through roadblocks, you're going to give some of it away. Nobody intended that, but that's the realities, and you want to try to stay alive. To the first question, how did I get into this? I think life is a whole series of both influences and accidents. We were talking before, and I think the compassion actually for immigrant experiences that I realized early on in life, and the pride of being an Irish immigrant and singing Irish songs was part of that. I mean, I think it just made you feel you wanted to help downtrodden people and sing songs against the English king or whatever we did. So so that probably was part of it. And then there were a series of accidents. You get an appointment here, and then somebody asks you to write an article there. And so my career was very much influenced by opportunities. And I said to someone today, at least in my looking back, and I am romantic. I hope I'm romantic. The bottom line is you got to marry the right lady. And so because if you're in this field, you're away a lot of times. There's a lot of family trauma. And as a physician, you deal with that. There are lots of things that happen to field workers. It's a highly intense, very almost sometimes destructive, unless it's well planned, career. So I've just been very fortunate. I don't know how to answer that any better.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Cahill, you have been discussing very articulately your own experiences in humanitarian crisis situations, and that's certainly a large part of the work being done all over the world. But there's also a huge component of development work being done around the world, and I'm sure you've had the opportunity to see a number of organizations, political and private NGOs doing economic development and community development and clean water systems and all those things. Could you comment just a bit about professionalism relative to that kind of work and to the ongoing medical work like Doctors Without Borders and PIH and those groups, as opposed to the smaller groups?
Sure. If you approach humanitarian work, and we had this long discussion this afternoon, so I don't want to replay the whole thing that went on, you could approach it and say there are two ways. One is the emergency humanitarian relief operations. And that, as I said at the beginning of this talk, I thought I would structure the talk, and I worked hard on the talk to give you some personal things. So that's what I've done, and that's why I focused on that aspect of it. There's also, as someone talked of the, and very beautifully, of the sort of alchemists who do development work, who go out there and try to make gold and silver out of really dross. And so that they do, and that extension, the emergency work is, I don't want to say the easiest, because it does save lives and it keeps people going, and if you do it well, it naturally should have a transition into the development work. But I can't comment on, as somebody asked this afternoon, on the benefits of microfinance. I presume it's all very wonderful. I just don't know enough about it to comment on it. You can't just go in and do emergency work and think you're doing very much good if you're going to leave people in the same sordid situation that they lived in. If you don't think that there are wells, I mean, the whole history of public health is that things like sanitation are really important. And that's why I also mentioned clusters in my talk tonight, that even in emergency work, you start working with people who are doing water and sanitation and shelter and food and security. So the question is a very valid one, and in the limited time I had and the experience that I've had, I thought I would focus on what I did.
Dr. Cahill, first I wanted to say what an honor it is to hear you speak this evening, and I don't think I've been this inspired since I last heard you speak at Trinity College in Dublin several years ago. I wondered if you'd say a few words on the advent of governmental programs like Operation Hearts and Minds, and how the militarization of aid has, from your perspective, influenced, for better or for worse, humanitarian space.
No. It's a very important question because, and we talked about this again this afternoon, there was a point in the Iraq War where Colin Powell viewed humanitarians as force implementers, or that they were, and most humanitarians didn't want to be considered as we were just implementing the policies that some may or may have agreed with. I think that there are some organizations like Doctors Without Borders who really feel deeply that you should not cooperate with any military. I've worked in situations where if you didn't cooperate with the military, you just didn't get in. You couldn't go to the Pakistan earthquake and get up the hill without a military helicopter. It just didn't work. So I think there is always going to be a tension there. We also got in this afternoon to the not only the military getting into humanitarian work and using that, but for-profit groups getting in, and they're being more and more contracted, and that's going to pose new problems to those who think. So I don't think as I say, we deal with compromise all the time, and I think at some point you have to say, is this what you want as for yourself or not? I would be hesitant after, at least in my life, I don't want to get involved in selling my soul to things that I don't believe in, so I'm not going to do it. But is it going to happen? I mean, there are now private armies that we're subcontracting out, and we lower the number of military. We just hire, these private armies to go out. And is that a good thing or a bad thing? For a nation, I think for our nation, it's not a good thing, and I think we're better than that.
Dr. Cahill, first of all, welcome to Montana and welcome to the home of the Salish people, which the university is built on. Long history of the Salish people here. There is, thanks James, I forget about my height at times. There's a humanitarian issue about helping third world countries. And in this country, there's a disenfranchised group, the American Indians, who are not empowered at times, but are also considered third world countries. And you think about humanitarian issues impacting them, I often wonder if there is a long-term approach to work with indigenous peoples to help them maintain who they are, but yet fit into the world that we exist in now in a humanitarian way.
Again, I don't think one has to do humanitarian work overseas. I think you could do it right here. We were talking this afternoon or at luncheon of a doctor who works on the Mexican border with people trying to flee. I mean, it's not that far away that you can do it. I think you can do it almost anywhere. I don't think that anyone working overseas is unaware of the cultural concerns that you would have as a decent humanitarian worker, that you have the power, you have the money. And so as we talked this afternoon, part of the goal in humanitarian work is to emancipate the people who are now lost everything. They're there, and you don't want to make them more dependent on you. Now, where that fits in with the Native American Indian population and how humanitarian workers, if they did work on reservations or with the people, would have respect. I think that's certainly a growing area of awareness that anybody working in this field has to be cognizant of the cultural thing. And it's slightly different in the emergency, immediate things. You go in and you do things that you just have to do. But very quickly you get into the development phase, and that's where an awareness of those cultural needs. If you're really going to emancipate and empower people, you're going to have to get them on their feet and get out of the way and let them do their things. So I don't know. Anyone else?
Climate change is delivering increasingly frequent and severe body blows to the planet, yielding more and more humanitarian crisis of greater cost and duration. And the United States is the main obstacle to addressing climate change. Could you comment on that situation?
I'm aware that climate change, you just have to look at what Thailand's going through with floods, and they're going to go through. And so there's a predictability that disasters are not going to go away. They're probably going to increase in the years to come. And at least natural disasters, which we have made, so they're man-made disasters. But I think there are the far wiser people probably in this room to talk about what the American responsibility in climate change is, and does that have relevance. I'm right now in my UN capacity working on a project to see how can we prepare better for disasters and respond better to disasters when it's not just the climate change, it's the economic change. There's a big article in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago saying Republicans and Democrats are out to slash foreign aid, and you know that will happen in the Eurozone and everything else. So I think we're really in very difficult straits to say, but not impossible, maybe that's my Irish optimism, that we will find some ways to prepare better and to respond better. But I think some of the climate change causes for disasters, one has to be aware that they're there and they're going to cause disasters, but what to do about it, it's not my area.
Yeah, I'd just like your comments on self-sustainability and the ability to afford that. There's numerous small relief organizations all over the nation that send teams down to various countries for a week or two to provide health care, spending thousands of dollars to send these teams down where they sometimes may do great work, sometimes it's just a Band-Aid for a week or two. They could take that same money and hire local healthcare workers to provide health for probably months rather than a week or two, and also help with their economy and standard of living. But unless these local organizations send people down, the local communities aren't going to give them money. Any comments?
Yeah. I think there are various benefits that come from short-term health excursions of a week or two. They're not in my field, but I think we talked this afternoon. If you were an ophthalmologist and could go in and do cataracts for 2 weeks, you might, have hundreds of people seeing. So that could be a beneficial thing. If you were doing cleft palates, you can, close up people's faces, and that's a benefit. In medicine, as I tried to point out in the example of this old professor of mine, things are very slow. You don't change things by going down for a week. And so what would be the benefit? There was a young woman, I think at lunch today, who had gone somewhere. I think there's benefits very often to ourselves more, and at some stages those are justified. At the student stage, for example, except it may give a bad example, it does allow students to go out and see what the rest of that world is like out there, to come back hopefully enriched, hopefully better. And so I'm in favor of sort of young people going off and doing things. I think professionals shouldn't deceive themselves that a week in a foreign country is going to do very much. It's probably not. And whether you would ever raise the money, one of the problems with NGOs is all over the world how to raise money. They have to show pictures of starving children, and they have to show their flag or whatever they do. And are they going to get that money from the Mosul or whatever NGO it was if they say this is all going down to somewhere? You get into all sorts of other problems. Even when you give money, how do you account for the money? The donors increasingly want to know where that money's going, and they want to know what team down there where you're going to give it and hire people for probably, you're correct to say, for months and months, probably years for what you'd pay for an American team to go down. But people nowadays, for a lot of maybe good reasons, tax reasons, if nothing else, have to know that that money's going to where they think it's going. And I can assure you from working down there that it doesn't always go where you think it's going. So I think the answer is slightly complex in that there is value in some instances. You're right, the value measured in terms. And if you don't end up leaving behind some trained people, then clearly you're not doing very much. That is really self-indulgent, which I tried to talk about. And so that if you went down, in a consecutive, and I talked about my brother, whom, as I said, I love, but he goes down, and I don't have those discussions at home anymore because it makes no sense. So, I don't know.
I'm not quite as tall as some others. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about programs of countries, and particularly Western countries, that seem to be working better than others. And if there are particular programs or particular countries that can provide better examples for the rest of us in how to deal with humanitarian issues that particularly seem to impact the third world more than the developed world.
I'm not sure where the question was going. I think the biggest thing is to make sure that there is coordination of activities in the field. There's so many examples of responding to international humanitarian crises where there is no coordination. It's just people going down and wanting to do what they think is important at the time and leaving without any lasting impact, without any continuity of care. In medicine, this is, very often disastrous, and it's probably disastrous in most other fields, but people go down and they, do amputations and leave, and nobody knows who's going to follow up those. It simply doesn't work. I think it has gotten much, much better, particularly in the last, 20 years or so. There are now codes of conduct for most NGOs. There are now sphere standards of what you want a camp to look like. So people have worked hard to make that. Does any particular Western country stand out in that they're doing it better than others? I'd like to say that the Irish actually do a wonderful job, and they actually do it for a good reason, and that is that the missionaries, I don't know if any of you have ever gone up African rivers, but you'd be amazed how many Kevins there are up the African River because of missionaries. And they had the potato famine, and they're aware of particularly issues on hunger. So I think they do a very good job, and they're supported, and as opposed, as I point out today, and we have a right to have our own way of approaching foreign aid, but on the USAID brochure it says, this aid is given to promote the interests of the United States. And the Irish aid says, this aid is given to help those in need. That's just a very fundamental difference about how you go out and do things. But there are probably many others. I'm all in favor of Greeks too, by the way. So it's
Thank you for speaking. You obviously have spent a lot of your life working with the UN, and it seems like the United States struggles with our commitment to the UN, and I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah. I have spent a lot of time working at the UN. I really would argue that if you didn't have it, you'd have to discover it. I mean, there is no other organization that has the acceptability in most places, except the United States, to coordinate. You take the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. In most great crises, you have to choose someone to say, let's have the meeting there and let's try to see. They don't have the resources. They never were intended to have the resources. They do an awful lot of what no one ever wants to hear about. They do all the thankless things that go on. You talk about feeding people in Somalia. That's World Food Program. You talk about, these are the hidden people who do this every day, day in and day out. And I would hope that someday, which I don't expect, the United States is going to wake up and say, let's just find how they can help us to get to what we're trying to do. Right now, they seem to be the annual, and they have been all my life, so the annual, boy that you beat at the end of the budget period and say, we're not going to give any more money because they didn't vote this way or that way. That's part of reality, though. That's what I said before, that you learn you're dealing with realities. It's, I don't. Anyway, it gets me into deeper areas that I don't want to get into at this hour. But I'm very proud of the UN. I serve right now as the chief advisor to the President of the General Assembly for humanitarian and public health issues. I can tell you there is more serious concerns going on and more serious things that are trying to bring in all countries to work, and we're not the only player in town anymore. We never were.
I think it's time to wrap up.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Stay here with us, okay. I would like to offer a few words of thanks and recognition on behalf of the Office of the President of the University of Montana. My name is James McCusick, and I serve as Dean of the Davidson Honors College here at UM. And I'd like to invite Emily Cross, a student here, to start making her way forward to the podium. Emily, come on up. Where are you? Come on up. Come on up. This is the President's Lecture Series. It's the most prestigious lecture series on the campus of the University of Montana. And this particular lecture is known as the Kimmitt Public Service Lecture. Stan Kimmitt was the Secretary of the Senate of the United States for many years, known sometimes as the 101st Senator. And his family has endowed this lecture series as a testament to his public service on behalf not only of the people of Montana, but of the United States itself. Every year we invite a distinguished public figure who's done exemplary work in the field of public service, and this year we are honored to welcome Dr. Kevin Cahill in this role. I am now about to introduce the Kimmitt Scholar of the University of Montana. Every year there is a campus-wide competition. All 16,000 students at the University of Montana have an opportunity to apply to serve on Capitol Hill for a member of the Montana State delegation to the U.S. Senate and Congress. And this year, after that competition was over, Miss Emily Cross emerged as the winning student, and she did serve with Senator Max Baucus on Capitol Hill last summer. So please join me in recognizing Emily Cross. And please join me and Emily in thanking our speaker, Dr. Kevin Cahill.
Good job, sir. Thank you, Emily. Thank you very much.
And thank you all for attending. Good night.